In fiction as in history, it's the shudder that tells.
Almost all subjects could perhaps be expressed more coherently in the comic book form. I believe that history is one that responds particularly well to a comic book treatment.
I don't think anyone would disagree that the 20th century in many ways has been the worst that humanity's seen so far. And it's our belief that that demands a new form of horror.
Britain's new wave of horror comics provokes and shocks. The works of both Savoy Books and Alan Moore have been branded obscene, seized by the police. Their comic book heroes attract as strongly as they repel.
Do you understand?
On the one hand, you've got the glamour of violence and the glamour of the characters themselves. But on the other hand, you've got them being involved in events which are totally beyond the pale. And as far as the fascism and the racism goes, they're thoroughly unacceptable. Lord Horror's based on William Joyce, the Nazi propagandist of the Second World War, did broadcast for the Nazis to England under the name Lord Haw-Haw.
He's a right-wing radical, and not many people have chosen right-wing radicals as heroes, sympathetic heroes in the comics.
The reader has to step back, especially if it's the central character, and actually examine what it is they're being shown and what they might be identifying with themselves. And if they are identifying with it, what does that say to themselves?
For myself, I always see Lord Horror as being a very Byronic character. He is a child Harold. He does roam around quite eccentrically from A to B. He's Manfred on his last Jungfrau, and I think he should look like that somehow. The man is a metropolitan Hamlet. He was a fashion violator, let's be honest, a fashion violator. So I like to think that I gave him his look. I mean, the man's a hairdresser's nightmare. You couldn't look like that and not be romantic to some extent.
His character builds on some of the horror characters of the 19th century. You know, you've got Sweeney Todd, that's kind of madness and razor blades. You've got Jack the Ripper, you've got Count Dracula stalking through the streets, which leads to Nosferatu, which is a kind of visual influence on some of horror's character. I think what we've added is an extra edge of darkness, which suits the extra edge of darkness that's in our century and not in the previous one.
Said the bells of St. Martin's, when will you pay me? Said the bells of Old Bailey.
In the course of From Hell, we link up a number of the historical sites around London into a fascinating magical pattern. But of course, if you take a large enough magic marker and a small enough map, it's possible to make any pattern that you care to make.
So here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head.
One of the initial impetuses behind From Hell was probably born from the statement made by our much missed leader, Margaret Thatcher, when she suggested that we should return to Victorian values. In a sense, with From Hell, I think it would be a good idea and perhaps instructive if we found out what those Victorian values actually were.
Step right up and see the show.
See the show. See the show. Jack the Ripper is, even amongst serial killers, a special figure. He was never caught. He escaped not only into history, but into legend. What I wanted to do was to come up with a story that didn't solve the murder so much as tried to solve the entire society surrounding that murder. There is no cheap drama. There are no shots of sort of people running amok with bloody knives and sort of snarling. It's all very quiet. If we show people going into a sweet shop, that's believable. If we show them walking down the street, that's believable. If we show them cutting a prostitute's kidney out and hanging their entrails over her shoulder, that's believable. Now, if you had lived in the Whitechapel region during this period, in some way, that would have an effect upon the way that your life worked. We're not just talking about architecture here, we're talking about something that I suppose you could call psychotecture. The fact that buildings have a massive effect upon our minds. In fact, Hawksmoor's churches were designed to have a massive effect upon our minds. All of the forces that shape our lives now seem to have had their beginning then, whether you're talking about art or science or politics. In science, for example, the machine gun was invented in the 1880s, the motor car. In my researches, I found out that at more or less the same month that the Ripper murders happened here, Adolf Hitler was being conceived in Austria.
What I was trying to portray with the Holocaust illustrations was a kind of lateral view of real events, and it's what I call a metaphysical portrait of the death camps, not a realistic one. In a sense, we had to try and invent our own vocabulary. There's no story. It's just a succession of images. It's just dead, still shots of buildings, pipes, brickwork, skulls, things like that. And so you're just left with the pictures, which are worth 1,000 words as far as I'm concerned.
It is deliberately provocative in certain ways, yes, it is. There are sequences in it where I've submitted drawings to David, and he's actually said to me, oh, there can be much more blood on this page or whatever. And it is, there's always the desire to go one stage beyond what the last person did. And of course it has worked, that, you know, that approach has worked. We are now in a position where there is nothing like it. I mean, for better or for worse, for good and bad, people do use Savoy comics as a yardstick.
To me, the key scene in the entire From Hell is the murder and butchery of Mary Kelly, where he spent 2 hours in a room cutting up a woman. He had time to be, shall we say, creative. You have 30 pages of a man in a room with a dead body. There are snatches of dialogue when he imagines that he's talking to somebody who isn't in fact there. But there are also long, excruciating silent sequences which feel very nerve-shredding. These long silences where you just wish that he'd say something or do anything other than keep cutting pieces off of this woman. It becomes appalling. Hopefully, the reaction of the audience will be a long way removed from the general arousal that these films seem to usually elicit. I want them to actually be in that room with me and with him. What From Hell can tell us about our own lives is that those same ancient destructive forces, that same misogyny, that same darkness is still with us. And for all of our veneer of technology, we've not managed to banish those shadows even slightly.
So here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper.
As the century draws to its end, we find that our entire culture seems to be boiling and bubbling and erupting into strange new forms. I think that it is the job of artists to help us to understand the new shapes that our world is blossoming into.